So aminu wasbiru wasabiru. And then, so the musabara is how you, one thing about siyasa that I want to mention, which is important in relation to the male-female relationship. If you cannot politic yourself, you in no way can do it to others. It just doesn't work. So that is important to learn. And there are many verses in the Quran about that. أَتَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبِرِّ وَتَنْسَوْنَ أَنفُسَكُمْ. Do you command others to righteousness and you forget about your own souls? Okay. It doesn't work. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطَوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. Don't follow the خطوات of shaitan. وَمَنْ يَتَّبِعْ خُطَوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ يَأْمُرُ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. If you follow the path of shaitan, by nature, you will command to what's wrong. Do you see? In other words, if you've surrendered to your lower self, then you're going to be telling other people to do that as well. When I went to Las Vegas to talk to the Muslim community, when you came into the airport, it said, give in to temptations. There was a big sign on that literally, wallahi, that's what it said. Now, if you translate that into Arabic, aslim lil mughriyat, or aslim lil shahawat. It's saying submit to temptation. Now, who says that? And there's only one creature out there that's his message. And it's interesting because, shaitan is the great imitator. He loves to imitate. Allah says in the Quran that his throne is on water, so shaitan put his throne on the ocean. And when we were there, the thing about Las Vegas, it looks just like the Hijaz. It really does. It looks exact. You think you're in Saudi Arabia. And it's his Mecca. It's like that's where you go. That's the Hajj that people make. They go there. And I'm sure he's like this year they had 2 million Hajis in Mecca. He's like, this year they had, 3 million people visited Las Vegas. And what do they do there? It's amazing. I mean, they're in a state of ibadah. That's deep ibadah. And you can see them there. The Quran says, what are these images that you're so assiduously devoted to? Right? The tamathil antum aakifun alayha. I mean, what are these things? I mean, these are idols. They can't stop. And that's the thing about it. They cannot stop. Right? They're in there and and selling their wedding rings and doing all these things. So that's the other deen. I mean, and it's empty. That's the thing. You look at the faces, they don't look, I mean, on Hajj, it's amazing to see those faces of people on Hajj because they're in ibadah. And you get people, 60,000 people here together in a rock concert or something like that. And they have to have massive amounts of police. They always have fights that break out. People often get killed. Terrible things happen. Right? At Hajj, it's a miracle. I mean, they're all there right now. Right? They're all there. It's a miracle. They all come together. And people, if somebody gets angry, everybody's like, why do they remember that then? Because that happens here and people forget that. But on Hajj, they remember it. And that's a gift of being in a state of dhikr. So the idea of rectifying yourself, you cannot be a ra'i, a shepherd, if you're a wolf. I mean, you have to rectify yourself. And Allah says, عَلَيْكُمْ أَنفُسَكُمْ. Take care of your own souls. لَا يَضُرُّكُمْ مَنْ ضَلَّ إِذَا اهْتَدَيْتُمْ. Because those who have gone astray aren't going to harm you if you're guided. So if you're all worried about the rest of the world and you're not right with yourself, you're in trouble. Whereas if you're right with yourself, then you can genuinely worry about the rest of the world. And even the rest of the world is not in reality going to harm you. Especially the women. And something that a Muslim scholar from England, I visited him and his wife said an amazing thing. We were talking about just the state of the world. And she said, I think Allah has been so generous to women because it's not our business. It's the men's business. And they're the ones that are going to be taken into account for all that, not us. Because look at that mess out there. She said, all we have to worry about is this little house. that we're in. If we take care of that, we're fine. Whereas that thing out there, that's the men's responsibility. And she said, and the truth is, if these women had any brains at all, they wouldn't want to go out there. It's a completely insane idea to want to go out there. But men are told to go out there, even though most men don't want to do it either. Right? And the ones that do are mucking it up because they're out there for the wrong reasons. Right? So taking care of your own souls, right, is really important. And Sayyidina Umar, he said, تَفَقَّهُ قَبْلَ أَن تُسَوَّدُوا. Learn before you get into positions of responsibility. Because you won't know what to do. If you don't have competent people, you have to know what your competencies are, your core competencies, like they say in corporate America. Know what you can do. And then do it. And if you can't do it, you need to do something that involves something like that, you have to go out and learn it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَصَابِرُوا, which is musabara. This is the relationship between other people. And this relationship has different aspects. Because if you look, ultimately, your relationship with others will entail certain things. One of them, and this is all about tahammul al-mashaq, because that's what musabara is the ability to bear difficulty, which is part of what life is about. So the first is the difficulty of your own family, is the ability to have musabara with your wife, with your husband, with your children. Because that's your most immediate relationship with the other. And if that relationship is not sound, don't think your relationships out there are going to be sound. Because if you're being nice to people outside and you're being cruel to your family, that's like a petty third world tyrant. When they go outside of their country, they're nice because they don't have any power. Right? But when they're inside their country, they behave like dictators. That's the way all these petty dictators are. They're terrible with their own people, but then outside they're trying to have all these nice relationships because they're worried about getting overthrown and things like that. So that's the way a tyrant is inside the house. So that musabara is first with your family, and then with your relatives, aqarib, dealing with the fact that you're going to have difficulties with your family, and then with your jiran, your neighbors. And again, it extends out further and further. Now, the thing about the musabara, so that's one level of musabara. Then there's also the musabara of dealing with the ibadah, mu'amalat related to other people. So when you transact with people, there's a knowledge that when you go into the marketplace, you need to have patience. If you don't have patience, you're going to end up doing things that you regret. So being patient with other people in that, sabiru with other people in those things. Now, all of musabara deals with things that we don't like, makarih. And it comes from the bad akhlaq of other people, the bad character that they show you, their treachery, all of these things. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about this, He says, وَأَن تَعْفُوا أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى, that you should forgive and condone and pardon is closer to taqwa. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ, turn away from ignorant people. وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا يَقُولُونَ, be patient about what they say. وَهْجُرْهُمْ هَجْرًا جَمِيلًا, and leave them in a good way, not in a way that cuts it off, in a good way. And if you look at the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, nobody in history that I know of, nobody had, other than prophets, but the Prophet ﷺ, the way he dealt with people was always with musabara. You'll never find him losing his temper. You'll never find him taking revenge. Even the woman that poisoned him, he didn't take revenge from her. I mean, he was always forgiving. And that's what he taught. Because the Quran says, الَّذِينَ يَتَّبِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَ. Those who listen to what's being said from the Quran and they follow the best of it. Because the Quran has hasan and ahsan. It has good and it has better. The good is that you follow the hudud of Allah. And so The good of the Quran is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But immediately after that, what does He say? But to forgive is better. So that's the best. So Allah gives you the permission to take your haqq, but it's better to give up your haqq. And the best of people are the ones that follow the better way, the higher road. Both roads will get you to the same goal, which is the pleasure of Allah, but one gets you there much quicker. And one gets you to a higher station when you arrive because it's a higher road. So this idea of musabara is the idea of really bearing the difficulties of the world. And also, this relates, part of sabr, and I didn't go into this, but part of sabr is the patience with calamities and difficulties. So that's part of sabr, between you and your own soul, is dealing with calamity. This one has to do with calamities with others. That you patient and bear that, and do that. And from this also is ithar. وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. They prefer others to themselves even if they had need. So this is also musabara, which is where you actually prefer others to your own needs. All right? And the Ansar were the epitome of that because Allah mentions them. يُحِبُّونَ مَنْ هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ. They love those who migrate to them. They preferred them over their own souls. They were willing to give what they had to them. That's another aspect of musabara. And then also amr bin ma'ruf and nahi an al-munkar, because if you command good and forbid evil, difficult things happen to you. So being patient, musabara with that. وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا أَصَابَكَ. Allah command, Luqman says, وَأْمُرْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَانْهَى عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ, that to command to good and to forbid evil. And then he says to his son, and be patient about what afflicts you from other people. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells that. So, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اصْبِرُوا وَصَابِرُوا وَرَابِطُوا. And then there's another aspect to this, which is there are three things that prevent you from doing this. The sabr and the musabara. Only three things. The first is your shahawat, passion. You see, sleep is a shahwa. So getting up for fajr, if you're so engaged in that shahwa of sleep, that shahwa will override. Do you see? So that's a shahwa. Zina is from the shahwa of sexual pleasure. So if somebody allows that to overcome them, they'll actually go and do haram. Right? And then, so those are patient. Also patience. So patience with ibadah, and patience in doing worship of Allah, and patience in not doing wrongs. That's related to this shahwa. The sabr ala nafs has to do with shahwa. Right? And then the next thing that will prevent this is, and Allah says, وَمَنْ نَهَى نَفْسَ عَنْ هَوَاهَا, the one who prevents his soul from its desire. فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. They get paradise. That's their abode. So that's the reason to do it. So you have that hawa, and then ghadab. The next one is ghadab. See, anger, which is a deep emotion. And Muslims, we really, I think this is one of our biggest, because we have reason to be angry. Muslims have reason to be angry. Anyone that says Muslims don't have a reason to be angry, we do. There's a lot of reasons for Muslims to be angry. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned us of anger. The Prophet ﷺ said, when the man said, what should I do? He said, لا تغضب, don't get angry. He said, أوصيني, give me advice. In other words, what kind of advice is that? Give me real advice. لا تغضب, don't get angry. أوصيني, give me real advice. لا تغضب, 3 times. Don't get angry. Because anger, and differentiating between indignation, which is anger for the sake of Allah, and wrath, which is anger for the self. Right? Our anger tends to be wrath. It's for ourselves. It's not for Allah. I mean, we would like to delude ourselves that it's for Allah. The Prophet ﷺ had indignation. He did not have wrath. He was upset about wrongs. And there are things to get upset about out there, but how you go about that in order to change them. If you allow your anger to overcome you, your wrath to overcome you, 2 things happen. One, you'll consume yourself in that anger and become worse than the thing that you're angry at. And a good example of that is Muslims that begin to use violence against those who are violent to them in ways that are unacceptable. I mean, defense is one thing, but killing innocent people, things like that. That comes out of wrath. That is wrath. Because the end is justified, the means is justified by the end, which is not our philosophy. It's an alien philosophy. So this idea of rabitu is to be vigilant about shahwa, about ghadab, and the third one is hirs, which is it's covetousness. You cannot prefer others if you're holding on to what you have. You can't give sadaqah if you have this covetousness. Now, each one of these relate to a center in the human being, which is the center we've been commanded to control. The first is the quwwa shahwaniyya, which is the concupiscent soul, the soul that's related to shahwa. And the second is the quwwa al-ghadabiyya, which is the irascible soul. And the third is the quwwa al-aqliyya, which is the rational soul. In the first soul, we're commanded to guard against that. The second soul, the emotions. And then the third soul is understanding things as they are. And hirs, covetousness, comes from a misunderstanding of the nature of the world. You want to hold on to things because, one, you think that it's permanent, and it's not. And two, because you don't realize by letting go, you open up for a flow to receive more. You see, if you're holding on to something and not letting go. And then finally, after Allah says, وَرَابِطُوا وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. In other words, why are you doing all this? Why are you doing all this? Why are you doing this sabr, musabara, and murabata? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do it for the sake of God. Don't do it for any other reason. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. And there's two reasons to do that. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. Guard yourself from incurring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's displeasure. And then, لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. That in order that you might have success. So the success is the akhirah, the Jannah, the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all those verses, that's one ayah of the Quran. Right? Ali Imran. And that's extraordinary because the entire surah is summed up. If you read the surah, it's all summed up in that final ayah.
This completes CD number 7.
Final ayah.
This completes CD. This begins CD number 8.
The next right was the right of his wife's milk for their children. That is a haqq that a man has, that his wife breastfeeds her children. It's one of the miracles, I think, of Quran, is the fact that there's such an emphasis on breastfeeding and also on the idea of lineage and breastfeeding affecting that, who you can marry and who you can't. Because we're only beginning to understand things related to breast milk, and I think there's going to be probably more and more eventually understanding why there's that relationship between two children that suckled from the same breast being such an important relationship. And the Prophet ﷺ said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْحَمْقَى فَإِنَّهَا تُغَذِّي. Don't use a dull-witted wet nurse because she is nurturing the child. In other words, there's IQ involvement here. And there was a study done in Israel in which they felt there was a strong enough correlation between breastfeeding and IQ in the first year. And they said that every month of breast milk raised the IQ level a point. So a child that had 1 year would actually go up 10 points. Now 10 points, I mean, even though IQs, I think, are limited in what they assess, but generally, I mean, there's a big difference between 10 points in people's abilities to do those type of spatio-reasoning tests that they have. So that's interesting. So that haqq al-irda'a is really important. Now, one of the things the Quran says, وَفِصَالُهُ فِي عَامَيْنِ, 2 years. And generally the fuqaha say you can go beyond that, but it shouldn't be more than 4 months. 2 years and 4 months. Some children have a very difficult time delinking, so it just depends on what the situation is. And you can obviously stop feeding before. The most important period, which no woman should avoid is those first 3 months, especially the early period where they have the colostrum, which is a very rich first milk, and that the children get antibodies, they get protection from illnesses, and children that are breastfed have been shown to have much lower rates of lung problems, of ear infections, asthmas, atopical skin disorders. So it's really important. Now, there are a few reasons why a woman does not have to breastfeed. One is the ulama mentioned a woman of high social standing. The reason for that is in Jahili Arabia, they did not. Women that were wealthy did not breastfeed. They hired wet nurses, and Islam did not abrogate that. So it was carried over into the Sharia. So a woman who is from a wealthy family does not have to. But that is under the condition that you can find a wet nurse. So if she cannot find a wet nurse, then she has to breastfeed. And then stopping the breast milk should be with mutual consultation. Both parents have to agree to it. So if it's after 6 months, if it's after a year, it has to be agreed on. It doesn't have to go a full 2 years. It's obviously preferable for the child, but it does not have to go a full 2 years. And when they stop, they should... And then the second is a wife who's sick and unable to fulfill that obligation. So she does not have to do that. And also what can happen is if a woman gets pregnant, which can happen almost immediately after giving birth, I mean, can happen depending on how quick they heal, that a woman can get pregnant. It's unusual, but they can. And if she does, what will often happen is the hormone level in the milk becomes intolerant to the child becomes intolerant to it. So they actually don't want the breast. They'll actually refuse it. So that will happen. So if the child refuses, that is also a valid reason. And if her milk is not abundant. So, and there's herbs that can increase milk flow and things like that. And sometimes it takes a little while for the glands to actually start that flow. But generally, a woman should do that. Now, during her iddah period, which is that waiting period of 3 menstrual cycles, she's also obliged to nurse her child. And if the talaq is what's called ba'in, because there's 2 types of talaq. There's talaq raj'i, which is reconciliatorial divorce. In other words, they can reconcile within that 3-month period. The second is baynun al-kubra, which is irrevocable divorce or irreconcilable divorce. And in that case, she is not obliged to nurse the child. And she must be paid a wage by her ex-husband for nursing. So, because he's responsible now for the nafaqah of the child. So it's like food, and he has to pay for her to do that. And she also has a right, if the husband dies, she has a right to be paid from his inheritance during that suckling period. And then any foreign woman who nurses a child is entitled to a wage for her milk. So a woman can rent, right? She can, and they have surrogate mothers and things like that. I mean, that's something. I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think it's really sad that that's gone out of in culture, because they used to have that even in this culture, a wet nurse. I mean, there's an English word for it, but they did have that wet nurse concept, but it's really gone out. And I think some women actually are troubled by the idea of another woman suckling the child in this culture. They don't. It's a very alien concept. In a place like West Africa, people sometimes have 10 different mothers through wet nursing. And many of them, like the shuyukh that came here, have mothers that were black Africans, even though they're Arabs. So it was also a way of binding people with other peoples, because there's a rada'a, and then they become a mother, and you actually have to have birr al-walida. So like Sheikh Abdullah, when he goes to certain places, he goes and sees the women that gave him milk when he was a little baby. So that's a good thing. And then it also binds families together. And we know Sayyidina Hamza and the Prophet ﷺ were brothers in wet nurse, as well as being uncle and nephew. He was actually his brother in radha'a as well, in milk, in nursing. And then the ninth one is the right of a man that his wife treat his relatives with respect. Now obviously this goes both ways, but we're dealing with the rights of men right now. She has to show excellent character towards his parents and his relatives, and she should show no harm towards them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ashiruhunna bil ma'ruf." Be good to them, and that's part of mu'ashara bil ma'ruf, of living with good, is showing kindness to the family. And Allah says, "Asa an takrahu shay'an," that sometimes you hate a thing, and Allah puts much good in that thing. So you might not like, your in-laws, right? I mean, that's true. But there's a big reward. And that's the way believers think. They have a different criteria for looking at things. I mean, some people, I'm not going to have anything to do with them. Why should I respect people who don't respect me or whatever? But if you look at it from that I'm actually I'm getting a reward for this, it's a different thing, especially when you look at it in relation to Allah. I mean, people will do things for themselves and they won't do things for others. But if you see it as a reward, that it is for yourself, then there's a higher reason to do it. What Allah is saying is, look, if you relinquish these things that are difficult on yourself, you're going to get a reward for that. And so in the end, it is for you. You're doing something for yourself by doing it for others. And that's the beauty of Islam, is it puts a different perspective, because ultimately we are egocentric. We are the center of our universes. I mean, that's human nature, is that you are. But what Islam does is it transforms your understanding of that. And so you begin and then the beauty of it is that once you start doing that, Allah gives you a pleasure in doing that. The more you become in control of your own negative impulses, the stronger you feel. That's the beauty of it. Because you're in command. It's not your nafs. You are in command. If your nafs is in command, it's always a disaster. You'll always feel bad after, once you let the soul take control, you always feel bad. That's what Imam al-Busayri says, that if you allow the soul to take over, yusmi aw yasimi, it'll either destroy you or bring shame on you. And it's one or the other. Right? That's really important. And then also the right of lineage and religion. It's a husband's right that his child, whether male or female, take his family name and follow his religion. So the child, there's nothing wrong with having a middle maternal name if that's a urf. In some cultures, it's the custom of the people to have a middle maternal name. Mexican culture does that. So there's nothing wrong with that. But it's the haqq of the man that the child take his name. He's so-and-so or she's so-and-so, the son or daughter of so-and-so. And it can be a family name or it can be the name of the husbands. Because there's two types of names. You have like Muhammad bin Abdullah, right? Which is the family name. This Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, and then Al-Hashmi, which is the name of the surname that they have. All right. So you have the surname, and then you have the name of the father. So you can do either one. You can have your son have your direct name, bin so and so, or the son of so and so, and that's what most of those names are. My last name is just the son of John. That's all it means, Hanson. So if you have a last name, many of the last names in English, that Johnson, these are names that have son of so-and-so. Just about this, in terms of illegitimate children, this is a problem in our culture in particular, is the idea of illegitimate children. If there's a shubha in the marriage, you always get the child, which means if there's any way that the marriage can be justified, because some marriages are invalid, but still they're sustained by the fact that there's a shubha, which is some doubtful matter is introduced into it. So if there is some doubtful matter, then it's better to go with the lineage. Now, test tube babies, which there's going to be more of that. and for people that become Muslim, if the egg and the sperm are from the parents, then it's a valid lineage. But if it's not, if it's from like some bank or something like that, or the egg is taken from another woman and implanted in the woman, then it's not lineage. It's considered the same as fornication, even though the act wasn't physical act, but the lineage is broken. There's reasons for that relate to prohibition of marrying others and things like that. So, but these are opening up really difficult questions, I think, for fuqaha, because one of the things about life, is that in a pre-industrial society, things were very clear, and core competencies of men and women were pretty clear as well. Whereas now, most of the core competencies of men have been pretty much usurped by women. In other words, women are able to do everything that modern men are able to do, by and large. Whereas in the past, that wasn't necessarily true for a number of reasons. But as work becomes much less dependent on physical differences, even though women can do physical labor, and they've always done physical things and done the work of men. Generally, if a woman's pregnant, she does physical labor, she can abort. There were reasons why they didn't have women do physical labor. But now you're getting this mixture. Men still cannot do what women can do. And it's obviously not from the aims and objectives of Sharia that they should have children. But they can't do that. That is something women can do that men cannot do. It's as simple as that. And as long as that remains the case, it's the Sharia perspective is certainly, I think, very, very relevant about men maintaining women for that reason, because it takes about 12 years for a woman to nurture a child to maturity. And she can do that. That is a core competency of a woman that a man just simply doesn't have, with rare exception. It's possible. And then about fertility medicine, you have to take the counsel of a faqih, because there's some things that are related that technically are prohibited. So if somebody's thinking about doing that, they really need to consult a faqih. And then lineage of legitimate children. Basically a legitimate child goes to the mother. The beauty of Islam is that it recognizes the institution of marriage in any culture and civilization. So a Buddhist, if they become Muslim, that marriage was valid in Islam. So they don't have to remarry. The same with a Sikh or any type of religious marriage, or even secular marriage. Like in this country, if they were married by a judge, the marriage is valid by Sharia, because whatever the urf of the people is. Now, in this country, they have what's called common law marriage, which is considered binding. And that, according to Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayy, because I asked him about this, he said that we should consider that. So if people have been in a long-term relationship, and even though they haven't been legally married, if the husband, they've been in a long-term monogamous relationship and the husband accepts the children as his own, then those children should have the lineage of the father. Whereas if it's in some cases where there isn't that type, then it doesn't. Now, for people that become Muslim, that are from illegitimate families, that is not something that they need to divulge to anybody. And the prohibition, not the prohibition, but the karahiyah of leading a prayer if you're from an illegitimate birth has to do with social status, and that it's not encouraged, that the imam is supposed to be an example and an exemplar for the rest of the community. So if the imam doesn't have a father, a legitimate father, then it's not a good example for the other community. That's why it's makruh. But the idea of somebody not leading the prayer, if other people don't know that about them and they're the most capable, then they're the people that should lead. So that's for the person as an individual. If they know that about themselves, if they know they're the most capable person of leading the prayer, there's no reason why they shouldn't lead the prayer for that reason. And the idea also is, the fitra state, which we've departed from, there's no sense just in metaphysical terms of what's happening, not at the physical level, but at the metaphysical level. Because when two people copulate, there's a metaphysical event taking place as well. And that's really what Islam is concerned with. It's concerned not with the physical act, but with the spiritual reality of the physical act. If it's done illegitimately, then there's a whole demonic presence. In other words, there's the energies out there that are malevolent that get involved. in the situation, which happens with sodomy and happens with any types of perversions. That's what happens. You're bringing in demonic elements, and we believe in that. I mean, that the dark energies are out there, and we do believe in them. And anybody that doesn't believe in them, I mean, the proof of something is, every cause has an effect, and we see the effects, and so the cause is explained by revelation. So those are realities. And there's a hadith in which it says that Iblis inseminates during fornication. So Iblis is actually participating in the act. That has to do with energies. So it's something that, a child that's born from that event should not be seen as evil or the devil's seed or something like that. They're a human being with all the rights and dignity of a human being. لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. One soul is not taken into account for the wrongs of another soul, which includes illegitimate children. So we don't believe that an illegitimate child inherits the sins of the parents. We don't believe that. Especially if it occurred out of, in any case, but if it occurred out of rape or something like that, then even the mother is not to be taken to any fault or blemish. And about adoption, tabanni is haram. And when we say adoption, it doesn't mean that you can't adopt a child legally here. What it means is that you do not give that child lineage. You don't claim that the child is your son. You don't give it your name. A child cannot take the name of somebody who's not their legitimate parent. That is what's haram. In terms of adopting children legally and raising them in your household, that is a very highly rewarding thing to do, both from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and also the person for just taking care of somebody. So, and if you're interested, there's a really useful article that was written by John Taylor Gatto called The American Family Masquerade. And John Taylor Gatto actually did a very extensive study on adoption and the terrible effects that adoption has on children. And the fact that they often become very disturbed, which again is not every adopted person or raised in adoption should be seen as that. But there is a lot of evidence to indicate that children that are brought up being told that their parents are these people, it has very bad effect on them psychologically. Actually, quite a bit of the patricide and the matricide that's occurred in this country occurred from adopted children who killed their parents. It's actually, if you look at a lot of these cases, you'll be surprised at how many were adopted. So the Quran prohibited that. And John Taylor Gatto actually, when I told him about that, he said that really struck him about the Quran, that the fact that it even mentioned that, because he said that his own research, and he said that he gave a few lectures on it, and he got such a frightening response from people. They were so upset about it that he stopped talking about it, because it's a very emotive issue. And adoption here in this country, there's a lot of very strange elements to the whole adoption industry and what's going on there. So now we go to the shared rights of both the wife and the husband. The first shared right is called Husn al-Ishra. And this is the most important one because this is the foundation of a good marriage. Husn al-Ishra is beautiful companionship. In other words, each spouse has the right to live with the other spouse in which they are actually treated very well. So this is a mutual right. In other words, the wife has a right to be treated beautifully by her husband. It's a haqq. It's a right. And the husband has a right to be treated beautifully by his wife. That's called husn al-ishra. And that there are verses about that. Treat them with kindness. Aisha radiallahu anhu relates a sound transmission that the Prophet ﷺ said, I am to you. It's a famous hadith about Abu Zara' and Zara'. It's a very beautiful hadith. There's whole books have been written just on this hadith alone. And it's a hadith where the Prophet describes these wives talking about their husbands. Each one says something about her husband. And then it comes to Zara' and she starts talking about Abu Zara' and how wonderful he was. And her life was just heaven and bliss with Abu Zara'. And then the one thing happens is that he marries another woman who was very beautiful. And Zara' became very jealous and ended up causing a divorce to happen. And then she married another man, but he was nothing compared to Abu Zara. And she really regretted it. And in the end, the Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha, I'm like Abu Zara to your Zara. And what he was telling her was, we have a very beautiful relationship, so don't destroy it by your jealousy, because you'll regret it. And I think that I mentioned that last week, just about the fact that all of his wives, none of them wanted a divorce from him. And there was difficulty in the household. It wasn't a bed of roses. There was difficulty. They had their human troubles that go with the domestic situation. All that was part of, for us, but also for the full experience of the human life that the Prophet ﷺ lived. In terms of what engenders and facilitates these relationships, one is really important, is Islamic etiquette. So it's very important just to remember that just like your brother, you're supposed to greet them with a smile. You're supposed to, these things you do with people outside, sometimes we forget that the people we're living with have more rights than other people to those same etiquettes. And also doing things for each other. Ithar, preferring the other to the self. This idea. And the thing about it is, men have to be very careful because there are many women that is their nature. Right? So in other words, a man can get into a very exploitive relationship with his wife because his wife, by her nature, especially women that were born in and raised in a more Eastern tradition, where there's a lot of double standards with the male and the female children. You can get into an exploitive relationship with the wife where you're allowing her to do everything and she says, oh, well, I love to do it. Well, that doesn't mean that she should be doing everything because she loves to do it, because she's getting all the reward, first of all. And second of all, she's going to appreciate, no matter what she says, when you help her out and do things for her. She will appreciate it because that's human nature. So just maintaining the etiquette. And then also a wife should not allow domestic concerns so that she forgets her own husband and then becomes like a domestic servant too, because that can happen. A woman becomes so preoccupied, she becomes more like a domestic servant and not realizing that there's a whole sakina, there should be spiritual relationships, spiritual growth between the two, things like that. And a man also has to be very careful of not getting into and this is all about, I'll really tell you in all honesty, the thing about life is the challenge for everybody is not to fall asleep. And it's really easy to just get into these patterns of perfunctory behavior and to forget what life is about. And you can really forget that this is it. Your life is an aggregate of moments. And that when you're with your wife or your husband, it can either be a horrible experience, it can be a wonderful experience, or it can be a missed experience. Right? John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And there's a lot of truth in that. You can get so caught up in these day-to-day concerns that life passes you by and you missed it. So family is like that. Your children are like that. It's very easy to lose sight of that. And also just the idea of offering each other reminders. It's good to remind each other. And a husband should not get upset if a wife reminds him about Allah and about his duties and things like that. And vice versa. It should be done in a nice way, with nasiha and everything, but it shouldn't be anger come out of that. It's very bad to do that. And then also, this is probably very rare nowadays, but it was probably much more common in the Muslim world, of doing too much ibadah, and where one forgets the rights of the family. And that comes from Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, who used to fast all the time, and Aisha told the Prophet about the neglect of the wife, and when he met Abdullah ibn Amr, he said to him, is that true? And he said yes, and he said, if that's the case, don't do it. He said, sleep and pray, fast and eat, because that's my sunnah. And then he said, your body has a right, your wife has a right, your family has a right. There are rights, there's huquq. So the right of your wife is that you spend time with her. That is a haqq. And then another important is adhering to the principles of forgiveness. That really forgiving and just letting it go. And one of the things that people in relationships will do is they'll hold on to these things, and it's just infantile behavior, and you have to see it for what it is. You're a pouting little child. That's all you're doing, and you're trying to make the other person miserable for doing something to you. It's infantile behavior. And you need to snap out of it. And we all will fall into that. But you have to snap out of it and just remind yourself. And if the other person reminds you of it, take the reminder. Don't make your life miserable for yourself and for others. Because that's all it is. And it doesn't, in the end of the day, it doesn't matter. So if something happens that upsets you, just let it go. And it will happen. It'll happen many, many times throughout your life. But just let it go. Don't hold on to it. The danger is not that it happens. That's going to happen. It's a given. The danger is that you never learn to overcome the desire to hold on to it. And it becomes also people derive perverse pleasure in that. So that happens. You get a pleasure in making somebody feel miserable. And one of the things about, they've done studies on cheerfulness and things, and cheerfulness and good nature is very contagious. If somebody is in a cheerful and a good nature, they can actually affect other people much more powerfully than irritability, although irritability is also contagious, but it doesn't spread as easily as good nature. I mean, they've done really interesting studies about this, to watch this. And depression is difficult, very difficult to actually be transferred to somebody. It can happen. If you live with a depressed person, you can become depressed, but it's actually difficult for that to happen. It's quite unusual. But well-being does not. You can actually transform somebody's state quite easily if you're up and they're down. And you can see this with children. If children pout and do these things, you can, just with silly faces and things, you can get them to break a smile. And once you've got them there, they know. They can't hold on to it. So it's interesting just breaking that infantile desire. And I think the Prophet ﷺ was an absolute master, like everything he did. He was a master at that, of breaking that state that people got into. And it doesn't mean that he didn't have periods. There were difficult periods. But generally, that was what he did. Now, it's important to keep in mind that marital life, due to the constant interaction and to psycho-emotional states that people go through. We go through different psycho-emotional states throughout the day or the week or the month. And that there's situations where discontent, displeasure occur. And you can do these things. These are normal occurrences. And even the Prophet ﷺ, Aisha radiallahu anhu, the Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha, I know when you're upset with me. And she said, how do you know that? And he said, because when you're pleased with me, you say, Wa Rabbi Muhammad, by the Lord of Muhammad. But when you're upset with me, you say, Wa Rabbi Ibrahim, by the Lord of Ibrahim. And Aisha laughed. And she said, that's true, by Allah, it's true. I would never abandon anything but your name. I mean, that's an example. And then also this idea that the Prophet ﷺ said, a mu'min should never dislike a believer. If he dislikes one quality, he should focus on the qualities he likes. So every person is going to have things that bother you and things that you like about them. And the thing about your spouse is that you should look at those qualities that are pleasing. Now, one thing that you can do is you can talk about things that bother about the other person. And then the person tries to work on those things, especially if they relate to things that are shortcomings Islamically, like anger, short temper, things like that. I mean, those things should be brought. You need to deal with those because there's no reason why they should continue. Those are things that people can overcome. Also, the Prophet ﷺ said, the most perfect of believers in faith are those with the most excellent character. And the best of you are the best of you to your women. And there's a beautiful poem by Jalaluddin al-Rumi, where he said the Prophet ﷺ said that women totally dominate men of intellect and possessors of hearts. But ignorant men dominate women, for they are shackled by an animal ferocity. They have no kindness, gentleness, or love, since animality dominates their nature. Love and kindness are human attributes. Anger and sensuality belong to the animals. That comes from a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ was talking to some women, and he said, I've never seen a creature that has more possession over a man of intellect than you. So what Rumi was taking that to another level of understanding, that the reason that they have so much power over is because these are people that have conquered their animal soul. And so they're not people that are going to dominate women. They're not people that are going to oppress. They're actually people that, because of the love and kindness that has overcome their souls, they actually allow the women their shortcomings without demanding change. And that's what Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu said about the verse in the Quran, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً, that men have 1 degree over women. That's what he said it was. He said it was relinquishing the right of a man for the woman. تَنَازُرْ عَنَ الْحَقِّ. Whereas he would not relinquish her rights. In other words, he would fulfill all of her rights, but he would not demand of her all of his rights. That is the degree that men have over women. And that's Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, who's the translator of the Quran. And one of the things also is just going the path of least resistance. Water puts out fire. Fire increases fire. If you look at the Prophet ﷺ, that was his strategy with people. Umar radiallahu anhu said, I once roared at my wife, and she answered back. I rebuked her for bandying words with me. She then said, why should you rebuke me for answering you back? By Allah, the wives of the Prophet dispute with him and even ignore him for a night and a day. So, she was saying, who do you think you are? Basically, that's what it is. He's saying, who do you think you are? The wives of the Prophet ﷺ do this to the Prophet, and he is the best example. So I think in that hadith, there's a real, and he went and indeed found that from Hafsa. He went and asked Hafsa, who was his daughter, do you do that? And he was shocked. But it changed his attitude, and we have when he was Khalifa, the man who came to his house, knocked on the door, and then he heard Omar's wife yelling at him. And he left. And Omar came out and said to him, what happened? He said, nothing. He said, no, you came, knocked on my door, what'd you want? He said, I didn't want anything. And he said, by Allah, tell me what you want. He said, well, I was going to come complain about my wife. But when I heard your wife, I said there was no point in complaining to you. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he said, this is my wife, the mother of my children. She maintains my house, cooks my food. Shouldn't I have patience with her if she gets upset with me? So there's the man who, roared. That's the change that occurred in him. And that's the point. People can change. Now, another reminder, and this is to the women in particular, although it goes to both, is the idea of ingratitude and boasting about things which haven't been given. These are two problems that are more predominant in women than in men. So the idea is, the Prophet ﷺ said once, he said, one of the worst qualities of women. And again, this is important to note that we're talking, when the Prophet ﷺ speaks like this, it's a generalization, does not apply to everybody, but it's a reminder to women. He said one of the worst qualities of women is that you can do a great deal for them for a lifetime, and then one time you do something wrong, and the woman will say, مَا عَلِمْتُ مِنْكَ خَيْرًا قَطْ. You've never done anything for me. And so the point of that is that it's important to keep in mind that even though people have shortcomings, you have to look at the overall context. And I think part of that is because women they can often move into the moment because of of that emotional component that in many women is stronger than men. And when they move into that, they're in the moment completely. And I think that's what that is about. So it's part of the nature of many women. And it was just a warning from the Prophet ﷺ to be careful of becoming ungrateful to a husband. And then the other thing is to claim to have been given things that she wasn't given. And this is in some superficial people, right? But it's a warning to the women. It can be both in men and women. The idea of saying, my husband did this for me, or my husband did that for me, to other women as a way of boasting or something like that, and that should not be done. Another mutual right is istimta'. I mentioned this earlier with the women, the men's right of haqq al-istimta', but it's a mutual right. The reason why it's more emphasized in the men is, one, because the men are weaker in that area, and two, because it's the haqq of a man, if he calls his wife for that reason, that she should respond. For the woman, generally, that is not the case, but she is entitled to that haqq in the relationship, and it's grounds for divorce if that haqq is not fulfilled. And the ulama differed about how much and things like that. I mean, generally in the Maliki madhab, it's supposed to be, the haqq is that he sleep with her once in every 4 nights with his wife. And that is derived generally from the portion of legally entitled to a woman. So if a man has other than one wife, then that's what happens. You have 3, and then if there's 4 wives, then it's once every 4 nights. So that is considered a haqq. Now, just one thing about this is, according to sacred law, the Prophet ﷺ, when he said in a hadith, why didn't you marry a virgin so you could play with her and she with you, that is part of the maqasid al-sharia in marriage, which is mula'aba and muda'aba, of having that type of intimacy. And obviously for a man who's marrying for the first time, it's easier for that if he marries a virgin. When the man told the Prophet ﷺ that the reason that he was marrying a non-virgin is because he had children and he did not want to bring somebody that was inexperienced like that, the Prophet praised him for that. So that would also depend on things. Just here, I want to go over this. The Quran says, خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, man is created weak. Most of the commentators say its relation to sexual desire of women. And so if passion overcomes a man, he's obviously he becomes incapable of reasoning and often controlling the animal urges. And so the spouse is a hisan. And that's why the Arabic word for married is mahsan, which literally means fortified. So it's through your spouse that you're protected. It becomes a fortification for your private parts. It's guarding you from doing something which is haram. Now, one of the things about that, it's not simply the sexual discharge, right? That's one aspect, but it's not simply that. Because one of the things about when people come together is that there is an effect in the other realms. And angels are pleased about a man and a wife and their relationship. So there's that aspect to it. And one of the things about the sakina that comes out of that, the Arabs call it nawmat al-arus, which is the sleep that occurs after people have intimacy. And it's a sleep that results from that sakina. In other words, it's a deep type of sleep, and it's a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Imam al-Ghazali radiallahu anhu said that sensual pleasure is really an indication of the delight of akhirah. That's what he said it was. That it was Allah was giving the human being a glimpse of the delights of the akhirah. And that's why in the Quran, those delights are often described in those terms. And one of the things that one of the scholars of Andalusia said, that some have considered marriage an animal appetite. Shahwa haywaniya in Arabic. He said they declare themselves beyond it. And this is like in the Christian religion, it's seen as a low thing. And so the priest says, I'm above this, or the monk. And he says, and yet they call it with the noblest of names, hayawan, because haya is an attribute of God. And it's the same in our language. You say animus. Animal comes from animus, which is the soul. Anima is life, right? Animated person is a lively person. So that noble quality of life. And he says, what is more noble than life? What they believe to be an ugliness in their eyes is identical, is actually the opposite with people who have knowledge of Allah. And that is why Imam Nawawi radiallahu anhu said, all of the appetites harden the heart when indulged in, except sexual intimacy in a legal relationship. It has the opposite effect. It softens the heart. And you will see often, especially with men, that if somebody is not married, they can actually become hard. And you'll see a transformation when they get married. They actually become more gentle and more patient, less angry. And that's why the Muslim world is very problematic now, because there's so many young men under 25 that aren't married, and it's not a good thing. Traditionally, people got married early. So actually, marriage does have an effect on your psychological state. And that's important to know that. And also the Prophet ﷺ said that the gift, that all of life is a pleasure, and the highest pleasure in life is a righteous wife. And mafhum al-awla as well for a woman is that it's a righteous husband. And Qadi Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said, Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who's a great Maliki scholar from Andalusia, and this is important, he said, quote, a woman's demand for sexual intercourse from her husband in no way negates praiseworthy modesty. So it's not from haya if she's desirous of that. Nor does it negate virtuous dignity, because it is an essential goal of marriage. In other words, it's one of the reasons why people get married. Thus, if he was being difficult, then she is permitted to demand it on religious grounds. And this is completely dignified demand on her part. So going to a qadi to complain to him about that is not seen as a breach of her modesty, because it's a haqq of hers. And obviously it could lead to problems, psychological problems. I mean, I was with Sheikh Khatri, and he did some marriage counseling, and there was somebody who had a lot of trouble, psychological trouble. And when we finished, he said to the man, he said, the woman wasn't in the room. He said, why aren't you sleeping with your wife? And he was like really shocked. And he said, how did you know that? And he said, because her state, the state she was in. And he said, it's very common. I've seen it in my own people a lot, that if a woman's not having intimacy with her husband, she goes into a state that has those same symptoms. So it can lead to psychological problems. People should be aware of that. And some people, they genuinely lose an interest. And also because of other matters, people get preoccupied, things like that. But forgetting that there is a responsibility there is really important.
This completes CD number 8.
Important.
This completes CD number 8.
Important.